Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking critical minerals. We're taking three and using those to challenge or reinforce narratives out there and some of the intractable problems the supply chains face, even with projected soaring future demand. We're taking Yttrium, Rhenium and Graphite, and each one tells a different story about our modern economy, about the critical mineral supply chain and pricing, and some of that challenges that poses to governments, companies, and us as individuals. To tell those stories, we're rejoined by Ellie Saklatvala, Head of Metals Pricing at the independent pricing agency Argus. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, particularly Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or give us a follow on YouTube. It really helps us to continue to grow the show and get great guests. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Ellie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's good to have you back. We're reprising our previous episode in covering three critical minerals to sort of surprise your friends and alarm your enemies in terms of how much knowledge you have. And each one is telling a little bit of a different story, a different angle on that overarching sort of critical minerals message that's so prevalent and relevant right now. The first one we're going to talk about is Yttrium, assuming I'm saying that correctly. And I guess this is your sort of classic rare earth supply chain dominated by China, but so critical for the modern industry, modern life, but also some nuances means that it's getting even more neglected in some senses and could be a real pinch point in our future. Let's start with the basics. Can you tell us what Yttrium is and where it's used?
Sure. Well, as you referenced, it's one of the rare earth elements, of which there are 17 in total. It is heavily produced in China, with some of the ores coming from just over the border in Myanmar. I think often when people think about rare earths or cover them, there's a very heavy focus on the magnets and the specific handful of rare earths that go into magnets. Yttrium is not one of those. So it does sometimes tend to get a bit overlooked, but it is strategically a really important material, lots of applications for civilian industry, but also some military as well. And it's used around the world. It's imported by major Asian economies like Japan and Korea and so on. We have significant volumes coming to Europe, the US, and so on. So yeah, as you said, it's a really classic story of a globally needed strategic material for which China is really in control of that supply chain.
Can you tell us specifically what is it used in and why is it so critical to the modern economy in countries like Japan and South Korea, Europe and the US, as you mentioned?
Yeah, well, it's quite a diverse product, lots of different applications. And over time, as technology evolves, people are always finding new ways to use all these different critical minerals. But I suppose the primary areas we'd look at for Yttrium nowadays, the electronics industry. So we're thinking about lighting, things like LEDs, phosphors. So that's obviously a major area for places like Japan and so on. We also have Yttrium going into the ceramics industry. It helps us make certain types of lasers, certain types of catalysts. You can metallize it, use it to help make alloys, which then feed into various industries, including medical. So it's a really diverse product for just, everyday industry applications that we would all interact with at some stage. And then there's the military angle, which is arguably, a smaller portion of the demand base by far, I think, but obviously very, very potent. And I guess one of the most well-known applications for Yttrium by military is to make things like thermal barrier coatings for missiles.
It's sort of slap bang in that kind of the modern economy in terms of LCD screens and so forth, but actually has critical military aspects as well. Can you tell us a little bit about just going to that supply chain? Obviously, we're going to talk about sort of how it's priced and kind of its relevancy today. But in terms of that supply chain, so firstly, this Yttrium is found in these iron absorption clays that are in southern China. I mean, this is one of those supply chains that's absolutely dominated by China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know there are rare earth deposits of various types located all over the world. But to get yttrium, as well as the other what we call medium and heavy rare earths, you need very specific deposits, very specific ores. So for a lot of that, it currently comes from Myanmar. Obviously, that supply chain has had quite a bit of turbulence around it in the past few years, what with COVID, the civil war, various different issues. So the border through which the ores often flow from Myanmar into China, that's often a sort of complicated topic. It can close at certain points. So yeah, a lot of the ores, they have to come from Myanmar over the border into China and then processed from there. There are a handful of other parts of the world where my understanding is you can extract yttrium as well. I think one of the main companies that's really trying to push forward on that now is Energy Fuels in the US. They have access to a lot of monazite from which you can get yttrium. So it can be diversified, but it's really difficult. It's harder than things like neodymium and praseodymium.
Yeah, and it's also, and again, this is sort of this backdrop to rare earths, or this whole critical mineral story in general. I mean, if we were in a sort of a happy, functioning global economy and kind of, marching forwards since the 90s, and free trade was ever expanding and we were going down Adam Smith route of specialization, you kind of want to keep this stuff in China, right? They do dominate processing almost 100% in China, but actually the way it is processed is really challenging to the environment, right? I mean, you're using ammonium sulfate, other chemicals to sort of leach this stuff out that then is causing cancer clusters locally, contaminating water. I mean, it's really quite a devastating material to produce, even at any quantity.
It's a messy process. You've got to get the ores in the first place, then usually using some sort of acid to separate out the rare earths. And the rare earths, you typically get them in a sort of mixed cluster, as it were. So you then, after that stage, need to separate out the rare earths from each other, which again, you need to use chemicals, often solvents. And then once you've separated the individual rare earth elements, you then need to convert into a usable form, by which we usually mean oxides, and then if you go further downstream, a metal itself. But yeah, this is highly technical stuff. Environmentally speaking, I think it's sort of well established that the rare earth industry has a checkered history when it comes to that. So these are difficult projects to get buy-in for around the world and in Western economies in particular.
It's sort of 8,000 to 10,000 tons is used a year, around the world, majority for phosphors, which go into LEDs and, all that piece, and then the rest scattered across the uses that you mentioned. Just before we turn to sort of how this weaves into the narrative today on trade disruption and tariffs and so forth. Firstly, can we just talk about how this thing is priced and the typical sort of mechanism for which it's exported and so on, and then we can talk about what's going on today.
In terms of the pricing, as with all the rare earth elements, it's a fairly sort of traditional sort of market. It's very much a physical commodity. We don't have paper mechanisms. We don't have futures contracts and things like that on rare earths. So you would have physical price indexes, which are constructed by price reporting agencies such as Argus. It's a human sort of process of constructing those prices. You will have analysts in various parts of the world, obviously for rare earths, largely in China, in Asia, and they literally speak to the market. And so gathering in intel that gets sifted, sorted, normalized, and converted into daily price indexes, which companies sign up for. And those indexes will either get formally written into supply contracts, or they might simply be referenced, as it were, during a negotiation. If they are written into a supply contract, it wouldn't be as simple as literally the price at which we're going is literally the index price. There are often formulas which can be tailored to be suitable to the counterparties and the exact requirements going around that material. So yeah, it's very much a sort of traditional physical market, physical pricing. It's an opaque sector. So you wouldn't see these sorts of prices out there publicly available. You really need to go to specialist providers who are constructing them and sign up, essentially.
Previous discussions you and I have had, and this is always kind of there's no intermediation really to speak of traders. Has that changed at all? Or are we seeing middlemen arise and act as intermediaries, or is this very much bilateral between whatever it might be, Samsung or LG and these producers?
The majority of the material that moves around is bilateral. So you would have long-term contracts fixed directly between, producer and end user. However, there are some traders active. They operate both on sort of long-term contract basis, but also feeding into the spot market, which is really important for helping to construct price indexes and allowing some degree of transparency into these markets. So traders are certainly active. It's usually quite specialist trading houses, not some of the the big giants that we associate with the commodities industry. These are usually tailored companies that have been handling specialist minerals and chemicals for many, many years. A lot of people will often say of things like rare earths that they're not so much commodities as specialist chemicals, specialist products, and therefore usually the people that are trading them are really specialized and understand the requirements in terms of handling the variations in chemistry, the variations in grade, and so on.
Yeah, and we had Chris Goodman on very early on in the podcast, episode like 10 or something, and it's also trading on hard mode, because this is a topic, whereas we're now starting to get used to the idea that one of the biggest risks now is political risk in things like energy or whatever it might be, copper and so forth. These specialist chemicals, these critical minerals and rare earths have really been subject to political risk for quite some time, just thinking back to the 2010s and the previous price spike. So it is definitely playing on hard mode. Are we seeing, though, because of the, I guess, first and foremost, the increase in demand and the prevalence of these rare earths across the modern technology suite, but also that volatility, are we seeing other traders start to step in, or that spot market get more active? What are you seeing there?
At this stage, I would say in the past, if you look at the past sort of 2 or 3 years, for example, where clearly there's been a ratcheting up of concerns around political risk and so on, alongside rising demand, I don't think there's been a major shift in terms of the players coming into the new players coming into the market and spot trade. We are seeing increased efforts to diversify the rare earth supply chain outside China as a whole. Although, it's slow going, it takes many, many years to develop new projects. And I would also caution that a lot of those efforts to diversify the supply chain, they're heavily focused on what we could loosely term the magnet rare earths. So things like NdPr, dysprosium, terbium, they're the famous 4 magnet materials. That's where a huge amount of the excitement is, a lot of the investment. It's quite an appealing area in terms of sort of political appeal. Some people are drawn to it because of the energy transition piece. Other people are obviously recognizing the importance of those magnets to the defense industry and so on. I do worry sometimes that when it comes to diversifying the supply chain and how it's traded, products like Yttrium somewhat slip under the radar. I don't see a major sort of evolution there. However, as I'm guessing we're probably going to talk about a little bit more, since the 4th of April, Yttrium has been put under China's export control scheme, which means all of a sudden there is a very severe squeeze on Yttrium supply outside China. I wonder if this will start forcing a bit of a change in that conversation and bringing some of these more niche rare earths more into the public gaze.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help navigate this change and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights, a global advisory network dedicated to the sector, providing senior advisors and subject matter experts to investment and infrastructure funds, law firms, and corporates. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections in energy and commodities to give clients the expertise they need when the stakes are high and insight matters. Learn more at encoinsights.com.
one of the issues is scale. So, we've just done an episode on the defense industry, the DoD in particular, and critical minerals. And one of the challenges about building your domestic supply chain up is, we're talking an 8,000 ton market a year. If you really cared about this, you could build up a stockpile that would last you quite some time, right, as well. So it's you face that issue of just actually the quantum of material is not that much, and no single buyer is sufficient to lock in a 20-year supply deal that would make it economic sense to build a mine. But we've kind of covered that. But yes, you're right. So, okay, so let's, this is one of those tricky ones that doesn't sit in the sort of the sexy magnet world, but is critical and was absolutely, under when the tariff war sort of kicked off on April 4th, was it that we saw an immediate response from China. What was that response and what's happened since?
Yeah, we had Trump did his, so-called Liberation Day tariffs on the 2nd of April. On the 4th of April, China announced export controls on certain rare earths and high-performance magnets. And yttrium is one of those rare earths that got hit with these measures. For those who don't know, with the export license scheme, which has existed for several years, and we've seen various other critical minerals put under that scheme before, essentially companies need to apply for an export license. In order to get that license, they have to complete a lot of very detailed paperwork. They have to divulge quite a lot of sensitive information, such as who would the eventual end user be, what would the eventual end use be, and they also need to specify volumes in terms of how much they expect their consumption would be over a defined period.
To stop stockpiling, I assume, right? That's part of the angle there.
Well, yeah, it does seem as if the idea is to limit surplus stocks around the world. It is how it looks, I would say, from the outside. So it's quite a rigorous process to apply. Not every company will want to apply because you do have to share a lot of commercial information you might not want to give it. Then you have to wait. Of course, there's a wait. In theory, you should be able to see some material start flowing by this stage. We're now in July. But a lesson that we've learned in the past 2 or 3 years, looking at how China implements these export controls, is that it can take many months to get the first licenses approved. China can turn the tap off at any point if they would like. So it's a really hairy system. What we've seen in the past couple of months since the 4th of April is a real scramble for material from buyers outside China if they have an urgent requirement. Not every end user has an urgent requirement. Some of them have some stocks. They can sit back a bit and wait. But there are always some companies out there who urgently need a bit of extra material right now. And for those people, they have had to pay a really hefty premium. We've seen spot trade for certain yttrium products several times higher in price than the Chinese market, a real scramble. And it has looked as if the scramble for yttrium has been a little bit more active, a little bit hotter than for some of the other rare earths affected by the export license system.
Yeah, can you just give us a final word on yttrium? Can you give us some sense of the actual price and how that's changed in response to this?
Sure. If we look at European prices, we index rare earth prices in both China and Europe. For a very long time, a sort of European delivered price for yttrium oxide would be maybe $6, $7, depends slightly on the purity. We've been seeing yttrium oxide trade in the prompt spot market in Europe lately at more like $60. So several times higher. We still have the Chinese market, under $10, whereas in the Atlantic, you're talking 5, 6, 7 times that. And it's a similar story on the metal, on the more processed product as well.
Yeah. And then for all our Swiss listeners, named after a Swiss town. So that's where it gets its name. But excellent. Well, the next metal is sort of, that's the classic intensely concentrated, almost 100% refined in or produced in China. China has, has complete control really over yttrium, and it's obviously a stick that it is willing to use. The next metal we're talking about is rhenium, which is almost the opposite of that story. It's to point out that it's not all one way with China. There are critical rare earths, critical minerals, critical metals that actually exist outside of China and that it is very dependent on, and the production for that sits in the West. So let's talk about rhenium, which is worth a lot more than yttrium. What is rhenium and what is it used in, and why is China, in a flip of this story, very keen to try and get its hands on it and the West to control production of it?
Yeah, so rhenium we class it as a minor metal. We call it a high temperature minor metal, meaning it's one of those materials that are really resilient, high melting point and so on. It is used heavily by the aerospace industry, for example, commonly used to make turbine blades. So you get it a lot in things like jet engines. Now, of course, when we talk about aerospace, we're largely talking about civilian. But of course, there's always a sort of defense industry overlap when we think about the aerospace supply chains. So yeah, the largest application I would say is still going into those turbine blades and aerospace. There is also a really interesting increase in demand from the medical industry. You can use rhenium to make all sorts of specialist alloys, and some of those can be used to make things like medical implants. And there's been some really interesting progress and new types of implants developed, which are expected to dramatically push up rhenium demand from the medical industry just within the next 2 years or so. The rhenium price, as you mentioned, it fetches a lot more than yttrium. And we've seen a very steep rise in prices, which began in June of last year. We had US demand for rhenium ramping up, partly because it had been a bit depressed because of the aerospace slowdown during COVID. So there was a natural recovery there. But in addition, the aerospace industry is simply ramping up as well. It's expanding and growing. So US demand was going up and up. And then the real curveball is that China stepped into the market in 2023, 2024, and imported huge amounts of rhenium, which I think took a lot of people by surprise. I think they imported roughly 25 tons in 2023, which I realize for some commodities that sounds tiny, but in the world of rhenium, you're talking roughly half of the market suddenly got imported by China within quite a narrow time frame, and the price has just rocketed.
Yeah, the classic case of actually relatively small quantities needed. In this case, an order of magnitude less than you do of yttrium, which means you can stockpile this stuff. And if you have a centralized government and an authoritarian one, you can go ahead and make those kind of plans pretty easily. Let's come back to that, but let's talk about just where does rhenium come from, and what it's associated obviously with copper mining, not obviously, but it's associated with copper mining in particular. Can you just give us some sense of that supply chain, and we can come on to the sort of the market itself?
Sure. So the largest producer of rhenium is Chile. And as you mentioned, it's really aligned with copper and moly and molybdenum. So it's a natural fit for Chile. They are home to the world's largest rhenium producer, which is Molymet, also obviously a major player for copper and molybdenum. Essentially, you extract rhenium from copper and molybdenum concentrates. One of the big challenges for the industry globally is that mine depletion means production has been dropping over the years. Chile's output now is quite a bit lower than it was 5 years ago, is my understanding. You can also get rhenium from places like Kazakhstan, from Poland, but it's quite an inelastic supply chain. When you're talking about a metal or a mineral that's a byproduct of other things, again, you're talking about sort of small volumes and quite a high cost in order to extract it. So it is quite inelastic. As mines have depleted in grade and quality, we're getting lower rhenium yields. There is also some recycling which goes on. But again, it's quite difficult to expand that supply stream, partly because of price volatility. You're only going to really bother recycling much rhenium when the price is very attractive. So when the rhenium price does drop, which it can, has done it many times, naturally the recyclers pull back a bit. And that also makes it a bit of a deterrent to investors to build out rhenium recycling capacity over the years.
In contrast to some of the other critical minerals, it's not really it is a processing bottleneck or a refining bottleneck, but it's actually this one. Rhenium's incredibly rare, isn't it? It's sort of 1 part per billion in the earth. So it itself is a truly rare critical mineral.
Absolutely. You need very specific ore bodies, you need specific grades, and then you need the willingness to actually invest in that capacity and get the stuff out. So it's not something that you can just, turn the tap on and get a bit more coming in. So as we've seen demand grow, and demand is going to keep growing, there's no sign of that growth slowing down right now. We're just seeing a market that is becoming more and more squeezed, both from Asian demand and Western.
Yeah, I did do some Googling around publicly traded companies that produce rhenium because it does sound
Yeah.
quite interesting. But there's only really one big copper miner in the US that does it, and the rest are private. I assume though that there is, because it is associated. Well, there's lots of interesting contrasts here. One is, of course, we're looking at pure sort of market for the most part economics here, right? Rhenium, really, it's probably more associated with the price of copper, I assume. And if we get copper's obviously through the roof right now and has a very positive story for long-term demand, that presumably will carry rhenium with it. Is that a fair statement? I mean, they are intimately coupled.
They are, yes. I think you probably need to do some thorough analysis of the copper ore bodies. If the copper price is doing well and keeps going up, in theory, we get investment in more copper projects. Does that then give rise to more rhenium production? I think that's a tricky question to answer off the cuff. One would hope, but yeah, it is a highly sort of technical area to try and get into.
Yeah, and then is this similarly? This is just long-term contracts or physical pricing, and it comes in the form of powders, I think, and we're obviously talking relatively small quantities here. Are there any nuances to the actual sort of market or pricing to rhenium versus other critical minerals?
Well, it is one of those sort of classic critical mineral markets where it's very much about the physical market. It's very opaque. So again, you've got companies like us compiling the indexes, publishing them, and then those tend to get written into contracts. It's interesting for most critical minerals, the whole world tends to hook around the Chinese market in terms of price. So you would have price indexes for other regions, and they will have their own characteristics, but there's always quite a strong dotted line back to China. Rhenium's different. For rhenium, the major benchmark for rhenium pricing, it's the Argus Rotterdam price. So that's a little bit unusual. Even though China is now stepping in as a major buyer and importer, really, this is a market where the contracts and the pricing still revolve around Europe. And again, they're writing it into contracts largely. Trade is predominantly booked under long-term contracts, but there is some spot trade as well, which is what my colleagues and I go looking for to try and get intel on. So there is a bit of spot liquidity out there. I would say as the market has become tighter and tighter, we have seen longer waiting lists for material. Typically, we'd be looking out there for, spot trades for shipment within the next few weeks. But since last year, we've been hearing of, waiting lists for rhenium APR, ammonium perrhenate, which is the most commonly traded form of it. We've been seeing wait lists in the US as people just try to find more material. So yeah, we're definitely seeing this squeeze playing out in terms of the trade and the wait periods.
Yeah, and that is directly attached to that stockpiling, essentially.
Yes, the fact that so much material has been booked up fairly ahead of time, it has left less material in traders' hands, in suppliers' hands to play with and portion out strategically over the rest of the year.
Yeah. And named after the Rhine River.
Yes.
Hello, I'm David Hunt, founder and managing director at Hyperion Search. Founded over a decade ago, Hyperion Search has helped organisations from major utilities to startups recruit their leadership teams and key individual contributors to accelerate both their growth and the energy transition. Our three main verticals are renewable power, energy storage, and e-mobility. The energy transition and the talent that delivers it has been our passion since day one. To find out more, visit hyperionsearch.com or listen to my Leaders in Cleantech podcast, available on all platforms.
Right, our final minor metal, believe it or not, is graphite, and I guess the story here is essentially one of explosive demand and actually probably unlocking it from kind of potentially from China's grip, but lots of the same points stay true, especially in terms of the environmental impact of producing this. But can you tell us the story of graphite? What are the applications?
Well, I think still to this day, the largest use of graphite is used by steel makers, not pencils and not batteries. It goes into steel making. It's often valued for its sort of high carbon content, the way it reacts in the chemistry during the steel making process. It does go into other areas as well. It is used to make pencils, of course, polishes, lubricants, things like this. The real buzz around graphite in recent years has, of course, been to do with batteries. You typically use graphite as the anode in a lithium-ion battery. Batteries, of course, we often think so much about the lithium, with fair reason, but by volume, graphite is the single largest component within a lithium-ion battery by quite some way. So that is seen as the major growth area for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
And a chemistry that seems quite stable as well, right? There's lots of talk about the cathode and changing chemistries there, but it seems like graphite has won the anode battle pretty convincingly.
It has. Well, it's a very good conductor of electricity, kind of allows quite an easy flow of electrons. So it really helps support efficient charging. It's quite a durable sort of material, so you can charge and discharge the battery many, many times without degradation. So you get that nice long life on the battery. It's not toxic, which can never be taken for granted in the world of metals and minerals. And it's fairly affordable, fairly easy to access, assuming you're happy to buy from China, compared with some other materials that you could use to make an anode.
Prior to the last, whatever we're talking here, 7 years or so, when this is, China's dominance in critical minerals and metals has come to the forefront, and it's now seen as a national security issue, and it's certainly a policy of economic, if not warfare, then at least squabbles. What was the market? Where is graphite found? Where is it? Well, it's found all over, but where is it made and processed? And how challenging is that process itself? I guess in terms of IP, but also in terms of environmental impacts.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a classic story of China dominating the supply chain. I think they account for maybe 75% of global production. So it's not quite as dominant as, say, some of the rare earths, for example, or something like gallium, but still very much a China-centric supply chain. In terms of the processing, yeah, it is technical. It is quite a threshold to cross there. But again, I would say not as environmentally problematic as some of the other commodities that the West is trying to diversify. And one of the major areas that I think is quite exciting with graphite right now is to do with the African deposits. There are various really interesting deposits in Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, Namibia, I think as well. A lot of really interesting, good quality natural graphite projects across that region, some of which have started production. Others are hoping to come online by 2027. So, yeah, we're potentially at a bit of an inflection point here where China has been hugely dominant when it comes to production. But we might start to see that shift a bit within the next 5 years, bringing fresh options to buyers and fresh ideas around pricing mechanisms.
Yeah. I met an individual who runs a company where they essentially, it's a Canadian graphite producer, but I think the major goal at the moment has been buying up acres of natural graphite deposits, because on the view that's as good as gold at the moment. But just on that supply chain, so you can obviously, there's natural deposits of this that you can mine. There's also synthetic graphite, this is where you get kind of heating these furnaces to 3,000 degrees using coal, and for your EV, which definitely gives it a pretty significant carbon footprint. And then it needs to get subsequently purified, which again is a pretty challenging process using acids and so forth. Is there any qualitative difference between, mined graphite and synthetic graphite? And do we have any sense of what the split is in terms of production between those two?
I mean, synthetic, I don't have a number to hand, but it would be certainly in the minority. In terms of the finished product, it will obviously vary depending on the producers and particularly the technologies being applied for the synthetic product, but I think it's relatively comparable. Of course, the major upside of the synthetic material is that they can really improve the environmental footprint, carbon side of things. So, there are some really interesting developments going on in places like Scandinavia. where they're developing, so-called cleaner graphite. And, it would be an entirely viable product, synthetic graphite product to use in the anodes. Of course, it will logically be more expensive. So then that becomes a question for end users, whether that's the OEMs, the automakers, or people like you and me who then buy the car. Often here, we're coming up against that age-old question of, are members of the public really willing to pay a significant premium for more sustainable, greener products? So I think that's a real question to do with some of these synthetic graphite producers right now. Are automakers and OEMs willing to pay that higher price? And are their customers willing to absorb some of that price as well?
Yeah, and I would argue to date, we haven't really seen anyone willing to pay a green premium unless it's backed up by availability of, producers get subsidies, or there's taxes or whatever it might be involved. And I guess, let's just talk a minute about pricing, and I kind of want to finish up on this idea of these new production coming online and actually what the bets truly are. So at the moment, is graphite, what kind of volumes are we talking? How different, is this quite an active spot market? How is it traded? How is it contrasted to some of those smaller quantum rare earths we've been discussing?
So I think China produced a bit over 1 million tons in 2024, which is pretty substantial volumes in the world of critical minerals. In terms of trade, you're talking largely the long-term contracts, supplemented with some spot trade, which, spot trade is always a minority portion of pretty much any of these critical mineral markets. And pricing-wise, historically and up till now, it's very much a physical market. So price reporting agencies like us gathering data, compiling price indexes, which then get written into contracts, simply referenced during a negotiation and a discussion. Up till now, graphite pricing has not really existed outside China. So, for example, at Argus, we price most of the critical minerals out there, and we have our Chinese prices, but then we will also have European, US, we might have Indian prices, Brazil, etc. With graphite, historically, it's only really been feasible to publish Chinese price indexes. And the reason for that is not only where the majority of material is produced and consumed, it's also because really that's where we get spot trade. So at the moment, very China-centric. Even if you are a company involved in graphite around the world, you will be realistically hooking your pricing discussions around the Chinese market, most likely China's domestic market. What's really interesting is that as we start to see some of those non-Chinese projects moving forward, that then opens up the potential to launch price indexes for graphite outside China, which we're in the process of doing at the moment. That then starts to give some of those non-Chinese producers a bit more autonomy and say over the value of their products, a little bit more control over their profit margins and so on. So this question about price mechanisms and having geographically diverse price mechanisms is a really important part of the conversation about how to build sustainable supply chains in different parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and it really gets back to that challenge there. So you've got a number of producers coming online who, by perforce as their jurisdictions, are going to have, the delta in prices essentially is one of environmental, guardianship, labor practices, all this piece, right? And I guess one of the challenges is if they're still in some way linked to that China price, two things happen. One is it's hard to be economically viable. Secondly, you're always at the mercy of China just flooding the market, right? I mean, what is the bet of this new production coming online that the relations will get so bad that the interaction would be severed, or actually you are going to see mandates from OEMs that the only material in their batteries must come from sources that, Western sources that have those attributes of sustainability, or at least some environmental considerations and labor laws, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think in terms of how this evolves, natural market forces will only take it so far. I think at a certain stage, you need to see governments and companies making a deliberate decision to change the way that they're using pricing mechanisms, to become open to the idea of paying that premium, whether it's for green metal or for metal that comes from other parts of the world. In terms of those non-Chinese projects, I mean, you do have things like, Syra in Mozambique. They've been going already since 2018. They've had a couple of bumps in the road, but they are very much real and active and ramping up. There are lots of individual sort of smaller producers and exploration companies in the graphite space. Some of them may not make it, but a handful might.
Yeah.
In terms of volume, they will be dwarfed by China. That is absolutely true. If China would like to flood the market, they certainly can. So I think in order to really move the dial on this, you probably would need to see a very deliberate choice made by governments and end users in the West, in other parts of Asia, etc., committing to a more diverse source base. We had a bit of a move toward that with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. But of course, we're now in sort of different territory now with Trump. So
Yeah.
we'll wait and see.
But I find it fascinating because it is, of all of the, these critical minerals and rare earths we discuss, this is one where actually there are sufficient attributes that it could develop you could truly develop a Western supply chain for it, right? It's significant volumes. There's not sort of an anticipation of chemistry changes. You've got a long demand picture ahead of you. It's not so complicated around the IP of actually refining and processing this. It does have all those attributes, but obviously against it is, and we're not even talking green here in some ways, we're just talking that actually there is some nod to the environment. There's some costs associated with stewardship of the local environment, right? It doesn't even have to be sort of a green attribute. It's just simply we're not going to allow the leaching runoff directly into the local waterways and so forth. But you've still got this inherent challenge that the West is playing by market forces and market rules, and unless you have cooperation, a large block, which could have been the West, but given the way US policies are going at the moment, that's no longer possible. I have to say it's a bit of a challenging bet until you get to a point where you kind of have these binary decisions by OEMs that they're no longer going to be using graphite from China, but then they're exposed to, well, okay, do you receive economic impacts or trade impacts from them saying, well, fine, if you're not buying our graphite, you're not getting our Yttrium.
Yeah.
It's just really challenging. This is why there are efforts to try and have pricing that's domestic supply chain only, just to try and unlock the domestic supply chains. But again, it just seems to be so challenging, and it's much harder on the other minerals. But graphite, as I say, has a lot going for it, but yet it still seems a really hard, row to hoe.
It is, and you do sort of wonder how many reasons do end users and governments need to be given to really get behind supply chain diversification. I mean, there's obviously, just the political risk, there's the environmental piece, but then there's also just the sheer logistical risk that comes of having more or less one supplier for these things. I mean, if you look at the past 5 years and coming through COVID, and just the absolute havoc that was caused there when China was hit with COVID, and then all the shipping issues with the container shipping industry trying to come out of COVID with container rates going very high and ships in the wrong places. I mean, there are just huge logistical risks if you are dependent for critical products on just one part of the world. But yes, it does seem that no matter how many reasons are clearly presented for why we need to diversify these supply chains, it does seem difficult to get the dots joined up and to get that will.
Mm. Well, it's not translating into a premium that your average consumer is willing to pay, right?
Yeah,
no one wants to pay $5,000 more for their Hummer 3 EV car to achieve supply chain independence.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, the way that Western governments are constructed is, this is all done by private enterprise, and the governments themselves aren't such big consumers that they can move markets themselves. So it is a real challenge. And also, frankly, as well, why would this always comes up against NIMBYism. I know we've kind of got this politics of abundance that's sort of emergent. The reason why the West, France, the US in particular, shifted their critical minerals supply chains to China is no one wants this stuff in their backyard. I do not want a graphite mine round the corner from my house, because I don't want to, so it's tricky and challenging, but there you go. Well, and graphite comes from the Greek to write, for those who are interested. So obviously pencils. Well, Ellie, it's been fabulous to have you on. I look forward to picking our next 3 and the stories behind them and challenging some of these narratives and reinforcing others. And look forward to having you back on in the future.
Thank you very much, Paul. Loved it.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.